Fall is in season, and you know what that means. Costumes, trick-or-treating, and pumpkin-spiced lattes. Or if you're anything like me, sitting in a dark room watching horror movies to try to feel like you're not alone. To celebrate the season, I'm going to go back and take a look at one of the series that I always find myself rewatching, Final Destination. So if you grew up in the 90s and 2000s, you'll probably remember these movies. A teenager has a vision of an extreme disaster and panics and avoids said disaster, and they usually bring along 6 to 8 other one-note trope characters along with them. And then, the personification of death, usually in the form of electric malfunctions or a strong gust of wind, kills the survivors one by one in elaborate Rube Goldberg machines. And it makes for some brain-off viewing, but despite the fact each film could feasibly be called a carbon copy of one another, the consensus is that the series became worse over time, and I agree. But I think we can go a bit deeper into the films and figure out exactly how this came to pass. Let's start with a quick recap of the first film. Originally written as an episode of The X-Files and suspiciously familiar to a 1961 episode of The Twilight Zone, Final Destination follows Alex Browning, who is going on a school trip to Paris. The plane takes off and immediately falls apart like it's made out of Lego, which I guess could happen if every single safety inspector took their vacation time all at once, but whatever. Alex then wakes up from this vision and confirms that it was Future Sight with a knob thing. I've never been on a plane, I don't really know anything about this. He then freaks out and gets kicked off the plane along with a few of his classmates and a teacher. What happens next is probably what sets the first film apart from the others. In a pre-9/11 world, Alex has frantically yelled that the plane is going to explode, and then it did. The feds get involved, and the obvious conclusion is that Alex is a terrorist. Over the course of the film, as Alex starts to understand how death works and can accurately predict who will be next, he only seems more and more unstable to those around him, aside from his peers who are also seeing the patterns. Alex needs to navigate death's design while also avoiding the FBI thinking he's a domestic terrorist turned serial killer. I think that's a pretty interesting angle, and we'll talk shortly about how the other films manage this and why I think it's much worse. So yeah, they get off the plane and then start dying in the order they should have on the plane. Weirdly, this movie didn't really set a good precedence for how the rest of the series would eventually start trending with the deaths. For starters, the first death ever, Todd, involves Death himself, Mr. Grim Reaper, magically causing the toilet to eject water so Todd would slip and choke to death on a clothesline in the tub. But then, after Todd dies, Death reabsorbs the water into the toilet bowl, so it looks like a suicide. Why? Why would Death, who is a fundamental universal concept, need to mess with Alex by making it look like his friend's death was his fault? I don't know, just always seemed really weird. Then we have the other deaths, hit by a bus, house explosion, piece of steel on the tracks. Most of them aren't really the Rube Goldberg machine vibe that later entries in the series have. This movie sets the rule that you can skip your own death if you're saved by someone else, and then you go to the end of the line, leading to a scenario where theoretically the survivors could cheat death forever as long as they're always there to intervene. Each subsequent film in the series adds little rules like this, except for the very worst one. All in all, I think this is a pretty solid movie, like on its own, and it's definitely a great first entry. Moving on, we have Final Destination 2, which upon rewatch I'd say is my favorite film in the whole series. The disaster of this one is the Route 23 pileup, which includes potentially the most iconic part of the series being the accident starting with these log trucks. Raise your hand in the comments if you specifically avoid driving behind these things because of this movie. Yeah, me too. So FT2 takes place exactly 1 year after the Flight 180 accident of FT1, and Clear, Alex's love interest, is directly involved in the second movie. Alex was killed off-screen because a brick fell on his head, which is hilarious because it implies that Death got so fed up with his bullshit that he just threw a brick at him. Even though this is my favorite in the series, by design there isn't a whole lot to talk about. So briefly, the characters who survive this film by being on the on-ramp behind Kimberly, our main character, are all characters who should be dead but didn't die because they were distracted by the Flight 180 survivors. That sounds a little confusing, but let's give an example. Our male lead, Tom Burke, was supposed to be at a shootout where an officer who took his place was killed, but instead he was sent to clean up Billy's remains off the train tracks. If Billy never got off the plane, Tom never would have went to the tracks, and therefore he would have died in the shootout. The movie never makes it clear if Death himself was responsible for all of them going on the highway at that exact time, or if it was just some sort of mega jackpot. If Death has that kind of power, I don't know why he's using light breezes to kill teenagers, but I digress. This connectivity to the first film and the idea of Death's design having this deep butterfly effect is why I like this one the best. It's the most thought-provoking by far. Yada yada, all the characters die in spectacular fashion, but this one introduces two ideas which were not present in the first movie. Firstly, when the teacher, Earl, tries to take himself out, all 6 shots misfire, which is borderline impossible. The movie explains that it wasn't his turn, so he's functionally immortal, I guess. Secondly, Kimberly and Officer Burke reset Death's plan by way of new life, which was initially thought to be having a baby, but ended up meaning that Kim just drowns herself and gets resuscitated. How that differs from interventions that simply pass the turn along from the first movie is beyond me. I mean, I get it, she technically died for a few minutes, but is Death himself the kind of dude to be like, yeah, you got me, and let you get away with those sort of semantics? Well, I guess he is, because, spoiler alert, Kimberly and Burke are the only 2 to ever survive a Final Destination movie. Alright, moving on from here, we're going to speed up because the movies are, really formulaic. FD3 starts with a roller coaster accident, and the big twist to this one is that the photos of the survivors taken before they get on the roller coaster give hints to their deaths. For some reason, this was always my favorite one when I was younger, but in retrospect, it's the one where the idea starts to fall apart. In the first movie, it's the first time that we're ever aware of this sort of death plan, revenge thing happening. Alex seems like a crazy person, and we learn about it as he does. In FD2, it's directly tied to the first one, and Clear does a lot of the legwork for explaining Death's design. In FD3, one of the survivors approaches Wendy, our main character girl, and says, "Hey, I found all this stuff out about Flight 180 and Alex Browning on the internet, and boom, now they know everything we know." Not to mention, in the premonition scene, Wendy specifically recounts the accident as if she had the same perspective film viewers did, knowing exactly what went wrong rather than seeing it from her own eyes like you'd expect. She's never once questioned about knowing that the roller coaster is going to derail either. But the main draw of this story seems to be that there's a mystery survivor that ends up being, of course, Wendy's little sister, and the twist is kind of ruined by the fact that she's literally the only character in the film that wasn't already a confirmed survivor. There's actually no other characters with a name besides her, so, not a great twist. So at the end of the movie, Wendy and her sister and their guy friend who went on the internet and found out about Alex defeat Death. Until months later when they meet again on a subway and Wendy has another premonition, but this time they can't escape it. Little fun fact, Wendy was supposed to be Kimberly's cousin from the second movie, and Kimberly and Tom were also supposed to be on the subway tying up all of Death's loose ends. But the Kimberly actress was busy with Criminal Minds, so that didn't happen. Because of this, those 2 get a pass to continue being the only survivors. Nah, actually I'm lying. Second fun fact, on the DVD extras for FD3, it's revealed in a newspaper that both Kimberly and Burke died off screen. I don't happen to have the DVD on hand, so I'll just try and put up a screenshot if I can find one. Next, we have the most hated film of them all, Final Destination 4. Actually, it's called The Final Destination. They decided to drop the numbering scheme for some reason. I do agree that this movie is the worst one, but frankly, I don't think the gap is as wide as people make it out to be. The opening disaster is a raceway accident, which is kind of low stakes comparatively to what we've gotten so far, but it immediately displays why this movie falters compared to its peers. The producers seem to want to increase the gore level of the kills, probably because of the popularity of Saw at the time. Unfortunately, it's all extremely CG'd, and it looks really bad because it was made in 2009. Again, after the disaster, all of the characters are handed information about Flight 180, and this one doesn't even try to add a twist to the formula. The main guy, Nick, has dreams of vague imagery hinting at the deaths, but it's essentially the photo thing from the third movie, and it seems like a cheap, lazy way to show off that the movie's in 3D, and it doesn't hold up very good. On top of that, in the third movie, Wendy actually used the information from the photos to attempt to save people. The mall explosion at the end of the movie would have been the biggest disaster the series ever had. No doubt thousands of people died. It turned out to be another premonition, and Nick saved everyone there. So logically, you'd think that Death now has thousands of loose ends to tie up, and the movie would present an interesting double disaster twist. No, of course not. The mall and its survivors are never ever mentioned again. So that thing I said about Kim and Burke being the only people to survive, it's a lie. All those people in the mall survived Death's design, I guess. Unless they all died in Rube Goldberg machine shortly after. Honestly, it's just kind of disappointing. But if you're 4 movies deep into the series, I don't think you're expecting Casablanca. And lastly, we have the 5th film, Final Destination 5. Back to numbering our entries, are we? So this one is a big improvement from the last 2, and actually tries to do something different. Of course, we have our opening disaster, this time a bridge collapsing, but from there we go back to a similar story from the first film. Main guy Sam has to explain to the authorities how he magically knew a bridge would collapse, and while it never really goes anywhere, it's just an added narrative perspective we've been sorely lacking since the first movie. Then the deaths happen, and they're okay, I guess. A few more iconic ones happen in this movie, namely the gymnastics scene and the LASIK eye surgery, but they're still pretty brutally CG'd. Eventually, the mortician from the first two movies adds the newest twist, that being that if you kill someone who isn't on death's list, you steal their lifespan, Death Note style. By adding this piece of information, you have a secondary antagonistic force, that being the survivors who are now thirsty for some homicide. It's interesting, but unfortunately there's not enough time in the film or characters that aren't on death's list for it to ever really reach its full potential. Finally, after our main story ends, Sam and his girlfriend, thinking they have won and are now ready to move on with their lives, hop on a plane so Sam can take a new job in Paris. As they're boarding, some teenagers, namely Alex Browning, are arguing and get thrown off the plane. Oh no. Flight 180 then explodes and Sam is burned to a crisp, bringing the entire series full circle. I really like this ending. I think it's a nice capstone to the series. They even do a little victory lap in the credits with all their most memorable death scenes. While this one isn't perfect, it's a big improvement from the crapshoot of the fourth one. And that's where the series sits today. Of course, none of these movies, except maybe the first one, are traditionally good films. They all have pretty glaring flaws, like they're extremely formulaic, there's almost no character development, and the story is typically just death is inescapable, which doesn't leave much room for rooting for the heroes. Surprisingly, they just got greenlit for a sixth movie, which should be coming out in 2024, and I'm kind of looking forward to see how they spice up what most would consider to be a pretty finished formula. This video wasn't exactly a ranking video, but in case you're wondering, the objective true ranking of these films is 1, 2, 5, 3, 4. Maybe one day I'll make a video ranking all the deaths in the series, because that's, sort of my thing. Let me know in the comments what your favorite Final Destination movie was, or the death that stuck with you the most over the years. I'd like to give a shout out to my patrons, Kick Asterisk and Excalibur. If you want to support me and get all sorts of cool benefits, the link is at the top of the description. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.